I'm Shane Morris with the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. How do you craft a major justice reform bill that will appeal to both progressives and conservatives, as well as to faith-based and secular organizations? According to Prison Fellowship's Heather Rice-Minus, you appeal to their core principles. Today on the BreakPoint Podcast, Heather Rice-Minus explains to the Colson Center's Warren Cole Smith how the First Step Act, a milestone criminal justice reform bill, garnered such overwhelming bipartisan support. She also discusses why she, a criminal justice reform advocate by profession, is also involved in the pro-life movement. Again, the answer is core principles. Here are Warren Cole Smith and Heather Rice-Minus.
Heather, thanks for being on the program. And there's a part of me that wants to be a little bit of a smart aleck and say, what's a prison reform girl like you doing in a place like this? And by that, I mean, you work for Prison Fellowship Ministries, and your life mission has been around prison reform and restorative justice and all those kinds of issues. Right. And yet here we are at Evangelicals for Life. Why do you want to be here at this kind of an event?
Well, I want to be here because I believe the same reasons that motivate us as believers to be pro-life on the issue of abortion. The values that we have of human dignity and believing every life has value extend to so many other crevices in America and so many other policy issues. And one of those, we believe strongly at Prison Fellowship, is the issue of criminal justice. We have so many people who are incarcerated in our country today. We're actually known as the world's leading incarcerator. And we believe people that are behind bars and those who are accused and victims of crime all have value and worth and should be treated with dignity and respect. And we want to see a justice system that restores all those who are impacted by crime and incarceration.
Well, as you and I are speaking, you haven't gone on stage yet, but you'll go on stage here within the next hour or so.
Right.
What are you going to tell the group? Is that going to be the core of your message, what you just said?
Yeah, that will be the core of it. I'll be sharing about why our belief in human dignity should extend to wanting to advance proportional punishment, making sure that our accountability is fair and just, to ensuring constructive prison culture. We want people who are inside to have opportunities to transform, and to unlocking second chances. People who have a criminal record in this country, an estimated 70 million, come back to our communities with so many challenges in terms of finding a job or going back to school or just the general stigma they face in the community and unfortunately often in our churches because they have a criminal record.
What you just said motivates two different kinds of questions for me. One you might call a positive, and the other one, we'll just ask it, and then you can characterize what it is. But Sure. One, sort of the positive aspect of it is that your presence here and your message here kind of gives the lie to, or is an implicit rebuttal to the idea that, you pro-lifers, you care about the babies in the womb, but you don't care about the women, you don't care about, caring for families, that are affected by unplanned pregnancies.
Sure.
And what you're saying is that, no, we're concerned with all of life. And I get that would be a positive for having someone like you and your perspective here. The other side of that coin, though, would be that is the pro-life movement becoming too diffused? Are they starting to care about too many issues and not just stay focused on the life issue? What would be your thought about those two questions?
Well, I think that as a strategy for those of us who are invested in seeing an end to abortions in this country, there could be an argument that we don't want to diffuse the focus on that. At the same time, I think there's so much added value to the rest of the country, seeing that as believers, we care about all life in all of its forms and the vulnerable in all of the forms that takes. And I think that only strengthens our ability to speak in a way that is persuasive and winsome to the rest of the country.
So you're here, you're bringing this message, and when you leave here, how is the life ethic going to inform what you do in the rest of your vocational life?
I think that when I think about human dignity and the life issue, for me, I have a deeply held passion for foster care, actually, and adoption. And so my husband and I are just starting the process of looking to adopt from foster care. And I think that that's so intricately linked to making sure that we are standing alongside and being available for families who do face unplanned pregnancies. In terms of prison fellowship, I think, we are out there in the trenches at the state level, at the federal level, in churches, trying to change hearts and minds about the justice system and speaking about human dignity and how that should impact how we view people who are incarcerated in our country.
I don't want you to say anything that you don't want to say that might be too personal, but I know you shared with me briefly about an experience that you had a few years ago.
Yeah.
Experienced a miscarriage that was both, of course, deeply personal to you and gave you a real connection to the life movement, but also told you a whole lot about what's going on in this country. Would you mind sharing that experience?
Sure. So a few years ago, I now have a beautiful, spunky daughter. Her name is Naomi. She's 2 years old. But a year before that, my husband and I, with our first pregnancy, actually experienced a miscarriage. Just shortly before we had already shared with some family. It was getting, close to the second trimester. And I actually fainted and was rushed to the emergency room during that process. And I actually live in a developing neighborhood, predominantly African-American neighborhood. I think the care people get at the hospital I was rushed to, it's probably not like what I usually get the privilege of experiencing, where I select to go. And I'll never forget that the doctor walked into the room after examining me and said, her first question to me was, well, did you want it? And for me, as someone who believes life starts at conception, and that was a life that God had knit in my womb. And I had all these hopes and dreams and prayers already so invested in this child. I just burst into tears. But, over the years after that experience and getting to reflect on it, it said so much to me. And every March for Life, I think about it, because we have so far to go in terms of how people view and value life. And what is that? Who is that is really the question, right? It should be the question for people. Who is that life that is waiting to become part of this world? And I think it says a lot about the care and way that our medical field is going about taking care of women who are in a place where they are struggling to decide what to do when they become pregnant. So that's something that has personally affected me and makes me think about how far we have to go to win the culture war on the life issue.
Heather, you've been working on prison reform, restorative justice issues for a very long time, and there was a milestone in that work that just occurred. Mm-hmm. The First Step Act was passed. It was a bipartisan bill. It was a long time in the making. I know you and your colleagues at Prison Fellowship had a lot to do with that. How did it feel? I mean, what was that moment like for you?
Right. So I've been at Prison Fellowship for nearly 6 years, and quite a bit of my work is focused on the federal level, representing our position to the administration and the Senate and the House. We've probably, for all of that time, been working on some iteration of this bill under different titles, certain components included and not included. And so I've literally sunk probably 6 years into finally seeing this bill pass. And we knew that the toughest hurdle would probably be getting it out of the Senate. We had some one very vocal opponent, I guess I will say, even though it had so much bipartisan support that made it difficult. And I was actually, watching the vote take place, making calls up until the last minute to different offices. We had some faith-based language in there we were working on and trying to get a last-minute amendment through to make sure that, that reflected what we wanted in terms of protecting faith-based opportunities in prisons.
When you say you were watching it and making last-minute, physically, where were you?
So physically, for the Senate version, for the Senate vote, I wasn't there watching it live. I was at my kitchen table. It was 9 p.m. at night, I believe, late at night. And I remember watching it and making these calls up until the last minute and being worried, and had a last minute call with a staffer from the administration I worked closely with, where he was like, "Heather, we've got it covered." And so I was like, all right, here we go, Lord. And I watched as the votes came in. All of the amendments that were proposed that we had been trying to defeat were defeated. The one amendment we were trying to get in was accepted by voice vote, which addressed this faith-based language. And then the bill went through 87-12 in the Senate, which was just unbelievable. And I literally had tears streaming down my face. And my husband had just helped some dear friends of ours move. And so he came back inside with my daughter, late at night and was like, what's wrong? And I was like, it just passed. It just passed.
Wow.
And he was like, so happy tears. I was like, yes, happy tears. So gave him a big hug. 2 days later, it went to the House. I got to actually go into the House gallery and watch it happen. We felt pretty good about that vote. It was overwhelming as well. And then the next day, our senior vice president, Craig DeRoche, was at the White House and got to speak to the president as the signing happened. But we call it our Christmas miracle. Took all these years, and what the bill will do is it's going to affect the federal prison system, make more programs available to the 180,000 men and women who are there, give them the opportunity to earn certain opportunities for completing programs. Some will qualify for the opportunity to move to pre-release custody in a halfway house or home confinement, so be closer to their family sooner. And then it also has some really significant, although so much work to do on sentencing reform, but there are some sentencing reforms in it that will allow people to get more just and fair sentences, particularly people who are sentenced for drug crimes.
So the fact that it was bipartisan support, passed overwhelmingly in both houses, I mean, does that give you any hope at all that maybe even controversial issues can be approached in a bipartisan way and some good outcomes? Because we hear so much about how divisive politics is these days and how divided we are as a country. That was a pretty tough issue, and yet it passed eventually overwhelmingly.
I think what gives me hope about it is sometimes the colleagues I work with in these very diverse coalitions, I mean, literally from the ACLU to the Heritage Foundation, will call it the last bipartisan issue left in Congress. But I think there's some great lessons learned from it that could apply to other issues in terms of the coalition we built. And one of those is that really what drove both sides of the aisle was this dedication to their values. This issue became one that, oftentimes conservatives had been a stumbling block to passing justice reform in the last few years. But so many of them have come out as champions of it, recognizing that making sentences more proportional, making our prisons a constructive place, and unlocking second chances for people means stronger families. It means people are going to transform and come home as contributing citizens instead of making new victims. And it means, a better economy and people going into jobs when they come home. And so we saw those values sort of shift and persuade those who had been roadblocks. And people may have different messages or, different ways of exactly explaining it or emphasizing different particular points, but really on both sides of the aisle, it was values that push this issue forward. And I think that is instructive for other issues. Let's look at our root values and what we share across the board.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that sort of opened my eyes up to this issue some years ago was a conversation I had with Richard Viguerie. And, Richard Viguerie is, hardcore conservative. So some people would call him the godfather of the modern conservative movement, helped get Reagan elected way back in the day.
Right.
And he said, the prison system in this country is the largest big government program on the planet. I mean, and of course, Richard Viguerie is also a committed Christian.
Right.
But he said, as a Christian, we should be offended by the way we treat our fellow image bearers in many cases in the prison system. But even if we're not a Christian, as conservatives, as economic and fiscal conservatives, I mean, we should be horrified by the massive amounts of money going into this system. I'm wondering if that attitude of a staunch, hardcore conservative whose credentials are without question in the conservative movement was a part of what made the difference.
Absolutely. We actually saw this bill try to get passed under the previous administration, and we just couldn't get it through. And I think it was there's so much credit to be had for the folks who stepped up to the plate under this administration. I mean, the president supported this bill. You had a whole coalition of conservative groups. You had law enforcement step forward. We partner and helped found Right on Crime. And he's a member of that. And there are so many others who spoke up in favor of this reform for the very thing you're saying. And my boss, Craig DeRoche, is a signatory of Right on Crime. And one of his lines that I think is brilliant when he speaks to conservatives is, if someone came home from a hospital sicker, you would be outraged, right? And you would say, we've got to do something about this. If your child came home from school and was getting less smart, you would be very concerned and say, this system's not working. Why are we putting our taxpayer dollars in this? You would demand accountability. But somehow, for the prison system, we don't seem to apply the same rigor of evaluation and want to make sure we're getting an effective use of our dollar. Whether or not you're a Christian, if you're a conservative, you should certainly be skeptical of the criminal justice system.
Yeah. Once Chuck Colson was asked, of course, the founder of Prison Fellowship, founder of the Colson Center, where I work now, as he was getting older, much older, he was asked by someone who was in a little bit of concern about the state of the evangelical movement and so on. They said, Chuck, we love you, but you're getting older. Where's the next Chuck Colson going to come from? And Chuck said, well, the first Chuck Colson came from prison. So that may be where the next Chuck Colson comes from.
Yeah.
I thought that was a pretty profound answer because in part it was Chuck's way of saying, it ain't about Chuck Colson. It was about what God did in my life, number one. And number two, it was a message of great hope. It basically said no matter who you are, you're made in the image of God, and God can redeem the years of the locust. God has a purpose for you. He cares about who you are and what you do and your ultimate destiny. I'm just wondering how that story hits you.
Well, so many thoughts come to mind with that. I mean, first I think of how aligned that is with the Bible, right? So many stories of redemption and hope come from people who were sometimes in prison. I think of the story of Joseph, right? And I think so often we do see these amazing transformations, and people who really understand what it means to hit rock bottom in many ways are stronger leaders as a result. My CEO, James Ackerman, and I went right before the bill was passed in the Senate to have a visit with Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma. And he actually said the same thing. He knew Chuck Colson personally, and he was talking about how, he does a lot of visits to Africa. He's very passionate about that. And there's so many people who have risen up as leaders who were once in prison. And so we were talking about that then. And then I think of our prison fellowship staff. 25% of our staff are formerly incarcerated people.
Wow.
And they are so incredible, such amazing voices. I think of my colleague Jesse Weiss, who worked on advocacy and is now helping us open our academy programs across the country. I think of Sammy Perez, who's on my team now, who's coaching everyday Christians on how to build relationships with their lawmakers, but he was once incarcerated in the youth system and is now doing amazing things. So many people across the country who are contributing. And I have to believe what Chuck Colson said is a pretty good prophecy that I believe will happen.
Thanks for listening to today's BreakPoint Podcast with Warren Cole-Smith and Heather Rice-Minus. Before we leave you today, I want to remind you that we're now accepting applications for the Colson Fellows at colsonfellows.org. The program prepares Christians in all walks of life to become leaders in their spheres of influence. During their 10 months of intensive worldview training, Colson Fellows attend webinars with Christian leaders, participate in 3 residencies, read classic books on Christian worldview, and prepare a concrete plan for ministry. For more information and to apply, visit colsonfellows.org. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. Thanks for listening.